When you deny the body, the soul reveals itself. The spiritual science of abstinence. Carl Jung. There are times when something inside begins to quiet down. The body stops responding to the world in the usual ways. Familiar desires start to fade. The urgency to be seen, touched, needed, disappears. But instead of panic, there's only space. A silence not of emptiness, but of presence. A silence that feels alive. The world teaches that when things go silent, something must be wrong. Silence is mistaken for absence, stillness for failure. But what if that silence is the beginning of something deeper? What if it is the soul, finally given enough room to speak? When external noise loses its pull and the senses no longer reach for validation or stimulation, awareness begins to turn inward. At first it's subtle, a pause, a discomfort, a pulling away from what used to feel necessary. But then the shift deepens. It becomes impossible to ignore. What once excited now feels hollow. What once satisfied now feels distant. This is not withdrawal from life. It's a return to something forgotten, a sacred realignment. The body is no longer chasing anything. It's not broken. It's listening. Dreams grow more vivid. Emotions become sharper. The smallest experiences begin to hold more weight. Time slows, silence stretches, space opens. This isn't about punishment. It's about presence, a reorientation of energy, a remembering of rhythm. Life begins to be lived from the inside out. Carl Jung once said that what we do not bring to consciousness appears in our lives as fate. And perhaps this is fate, redirected, inward, no longer acting from the shadows. The body, once entangled in impulse and performance, begins to feel sacred again, not because it's untouched, but because it's finally aligned. It's not about abstinence in the shallow sense. It's about a different kind of hunger. A hunger not for contact, but for clarity. Not for attention, but for truth. The silence of the body becomes a doorway, and on the other side of that door is something the world rarely speaks about. Stillness. As power, this path is often quiet, invisible to others. There are no medals for walking away from chaos, no applause for choosing silence. But something shifts beneath the surface. A new self begins to emerge, one that is not shaped by others, one that is whole, even in solitude. There will be moments of doubt. The world will tempt with noise, with movement, with distraction. Old patterns will knock. Familiar cravings will whisper, but the call inward is stronger. Because once the soul begins to speak, its voice, though gentle, is undeniable. The discomfort that arrives is not a sign of failure. It is transition, a sacred tension between what was and what is becoming. The pause before the transformation, the darkness before the bloom. This space feels raw, stripped of identity, of old roles, of names once answered to. There is no script here, no map, only breath and presence, and the quiet certainty that something true is unfolding. It may look like loneliness from the outside, but it's not loneliness. It's a meeting with what has always been waiting within. There's no longer a need to seek fulfillment in others, no need to prove worth by being chosen. That story dissolves here. What rises in its place is still and clear and undeniable. The body begins to rest, not from exhaustion, but from overextension. There's no need to perform, no need to impress. There's only the act of being, and that becomes enough. At first, the world resists this shift. It offers advice, distractions, noise, but none of it lands, because something deeper has already taken root. A seed planted in the silence, slowly beginning to bloom. Each day becomes a practice in presence, in choosing what aligns, in letting go of what doesn't. The appetite for superficial things fades, and in its place, a new kind of nourishment begins. There's no rush, no timeline, no fixed outcome, just breath and awareness, and truth unfolding in its own rhythm. The process is not linear. It curves, it contracts, it expands, There are days when the silence feels heavy, days when it feels like freedom, and both are part of the journey. It's not about becoming someone new. It's about returning to what's always been true, beneath the noise, beneath the habits, beneath the stories that were never real to begin with. This quiet is not lifeless. It is fertile, a waiting ground, a space where the soul prepares to speak not through words, but through presence. And when it does, everything begins to change, not externally, but within. The old cravings lose their grip. The need to be understood softens. The need to be needed disappears. And what remains is something solid, something real. The silence of the body becomes a language, one that doesn't shout but whispers, one that doesn't demand but reveals. What once felt like longing transforms into knowing. What once felt like lack becomes space. What once felt like stillness becomes sacred. In this silence, past wounds begin to speak, not to hurt, but to heal. The memories return, but they look different, softer, less charged, less personal. They are no longer chains. They are keys, keys to understanding, to release, to truth. The patterns that once repeated now feel distant, almost unfamiliar. The cycles no longer hold power, because they are no longer fed. Clarity replaces confusion. Stillness replaces urgency. Depth replaces drama. And from that depth, a new frequency begins to emerge. One that is not interested in survival, but in expression. Not in fitting in, but in becoming. No more seeking mirrors in others. No more waiting for permission to be whole. There is only presence now. Presence that doesn't fluctuate based on attention or affection. What once was sought is now given. From within. This is the power of silence. Not as retreat, but as return. Not as absence, but as alignment. And while the outer world may not understand, the inner world does. Fully, completely, wordlessly. There is no need to explain this change. It is not a concept. It is a lived truth, felt in the bones, carried in the breath, anchored in the heart. And once it's felt, truly felt, there is no turning back. What once passed for connection is no longer enough. What once passed for intimacy now feels performative. What once passed for love now feels conditional. Only what's real remains, and it's enough. This is not the end of desire. It's its refinement. Not the loss of love, but its purification. Not the denial of the body, but its sanctification. When the body grows quiet, the soul speaks. And when the soul speaks, the entire life begins to reorganize. From the inside out. No longer driven by hunger. No longer afraid of emptiness. No longer reaching for things that were never fulfilling. Stillness becomes the center. Silence becomes sacred, and the self, no longer fragmented, becomes whole. You've ever felt this? Shift deep inside, this quiet awakening. Know that it's not random. It's a sign that something is realigning. To go deeper into this process with clarity and structure, you'll find support in the Jung method. It's a powerful guide for those ready to meet their inner truth. The link is in the first comment. Now, let's continue. There comes a point where the silence is no longer uncomfortable. It becomes familiar, even comforting. Like returning to a language once forgotten, but never truly lost. Each pause between thoughts begins to feel like an invitation. Each breath becomes a bridge between past and present, between who one was and who one is becoming. This space is not about doing nothing. It's about doing the most essential thing of all, listening, not to the mind, not to the noise of old habits, but to something older, quieter, wiser, the kind of voice that never raises itself, but is always present when given the chance. From the outside, nothing looks different. Life continues as usual. But inside, everything is rearranging itself. Priorities shift. Values sharpen. Old attachments dissolve. Even joy takes on a new tone. Less excitement, more serenity. Less thrill, more meaning. It becomes clear that much of what was once pursued came from a place of fear. Fear of being alone. fear of being forgotten, fear of being without. But in this silence, that fear fades, not because it is pushed away, but because it is no longer needed. There's no need to chase what never truly belonged. No need to hold on to what was already leaving. Letting go no longer feels like loss. It feels like return. What remains in this space is what was always real: breath, awareness, presence. Some call this process healing. Others call it awakening. But labels don't matter. What matters is the sensation of coming home to oneself. A home that isn't built from memories or achievements, but from presence alone. With that comes a strange kind of strength, a quiet resilience. Not the kind that resists, but the kind that allows, that holds, that witnesses without collapsing. There is no more urgency, no more proving. The body, once used to tension, begins to relax into being. The nervous system resets. The heart finds its own rhythm. And the soul, no longer competing with the noise, finally gets to lead. And yet this isn't always a soft process. There are moments when the silence grows heavy, moments when the mind begs to return to what it once knew, when the unfamiliar feels too vast, too empty. But even this is part of the transformation. Because what is really dissolving is the false self, the one made of roles, masks, and expectations. And what is rising is something simpler, truer, and whole. There's a temptation to fill the silence, to seek something or someone to remind us of who we were. But those who stay, who remain in the fire of this transformation, discover something rare: the ability to be whole without needing to be completed. It's a remembering that nothing was ever missing, that nothing needs to be added, that the presence already here is enough. And that realization changes everything. Relationships become more spacious. Connection becomes sacred. Words become intentional. Time becomes slow and meaningful. And even when surrounded by others, the inner stillness remains. It is no longer disturbed by external chaos. It becomes the foundation, the center, the compass. This is where real discernment is born, not from fear or logic, but from resonance. What no longer aligns simply falls away, and what remains is allowed to stay, not out of need, but out of truth. Desire still exists, but it's no longer frantic. It's no longer hungry. It becomes selective, rooted, clear. It is no longer about filling a void. It is about honoring a fullness. And when something new enters, be it love, opportunity, or expression, it is met with presence, not desperation. There is no need to grasp, only space to receive. This way of being is not common. It doesn't fit neatly into the world's patterns. It can't be explained easily, but those who know. They know the difference between reacting and responding, between chasing and allowing, between wanting and knowing. The path doesn't get easier, but it does get clearer. What once felt confusing now feels aligned. What once felt chaotic now feels purposeful. And through it all, the silence remains. Not as an absence, but as a quiet reminder that presence is the real power. There is a moment when even pain transforms. It no longer defines. It teaches. It no longer wounds. It reveals. It becomes a mirror, reflecting not the past, but the growth that came from surviving it. Everything begins to carry meaning, every ending, every ache, every lost connection. All of it becomes part of the architecture of transformation. Not bricks of burden, but stones of wisdom. This is how one becomes unshakable, not by never falling, but by rising again and again, from a deeper place each time. It's not about arriving at perfection, it's about arriving fully into presence, accepting each moment as it is, not resisting, not escaping, just being. And in that being, something unexpected appears: peace. Not the peace that comes from control, but the peace that comes from surrender, from trusting that nothing is missing and everything is unfolding as it should. There will still be storms. There will still be uncertainty, but they no longer pull the same way. The inner anchor holds. The silence protects. The present sustains. Even joy begins to change shape. It's no longer loud or fleeting. It's soft, subtle, steady. It doesn't need to be expressed. It simply exists. This state isn't static. It flows, it evolves, but its foundation is steady, built not on validation, but on truth, not on identity, but on essence. And from that essence, life begins again, not as a race, not as a performance, but as a quiet unfolding. Every moment becomes sacred, every breath intentional, every interaction meaningful. The need to explain fades, the need to impress vanishes. The only need that remains is to be true, and in that truth, freedom is found. Not the kind that needs escape, but the kind that arrives in the middle of stillness and says, "You are already home." Because that's what this entire journey has been about. Not about changing who you are, but about removing what you never were, letting the real self rise. And in that rising, nothing is the same again. Because once someone has lived from presence, everything else feels like noise. The ordinary no longer satisfies. The shallow no longer fits. The false no longer fools, and life in all its mess and mystery becomes enough. Stillness becomes the revolution. Silence becomes the guide, and presence becomes the path. Not to become someone, but to become no one. Just being, just breath, just space, just awareness. This is the return to essence, the return to soul, and it changes everything.